So a couple things I want to cover today. First, where we are in the litigation. Secondly, presuming the Ketchikan side prevails in this, which is a presumption I don't make necessarily, that creates very interesting dynamics fiscally, where the courts are telling the state they have to pay the entire cost of education. That's not going to last. I have every confidence the legislature will figure out some alternative so that local government is back on the hook. So I also want to have a fiscal discussion about how we manage municipal funds during that interim, so that we don't basically have the tax capacity of the municipality only to have to return back up to the current level a year or two hence. So with that, Mr. Falsey, I'll turn it over to you to give us the update, and then we'll get to the fiscal matters.
Well, all right. I didn't mean to commandeer an initial spot in the meeting, but I guess I did plug in my laptop, and that sort of focused a lot of attention. I should say, I think everyone is aware, that I represented the Association of Alaska School Boards and Superintendents and the Council of School Administrators in filing an amicus brief in the lawsuit. So I came at it from that perspective. The reason I did plug in the laptop is that we had a presentation from the Ketchikan Gateway Borough and from Fairbanks North Star Borough. We're on the opposite side of the case, bringing the case at the Municipal Attorneys Association. And I presented these two slides, which I made for that purpose. And I was happy to present them to you today for what they're worth. So I think my position is, if Ketchikan wins, no one yet can say with certainty what that would actually be. Ketchikan has a different view. They think they do know what happens if they win. But here are just two slides to explain what I think to be the rules of the road. But I should say, by way of process point, the case has already been fully submitted to the Supreme Court. It has been argued. The Supreme Court is now just in the mode where it needs to issue a decision. We have no idea when that decision will actually come out. They have to circulate internal working drafts within 6 months, but they have no time limit for when that actually has to hit public. So if you'll follow me with a little bit into the legal weeds here, the legal question at issue in the Ketchikan Gateway school funding case is whether the required local contribution is a dedicated tax or violates the dedicated fund clause of the Alaska Constitution. So these are the slides that I presented. The way public school funding works in the state is defined by a statute, and there's all sorts of formulae. The one that matters is the amount of money that the state pays to us equals this fundamental basic need, is the VSA that we hear a lot about in the news, minus the required local contribution and minus some portion of federal impact aid. So the question in the case is, if Ketchikan wins, if the RLC, the required local contribution, is declared to be unconstitutional, what happens to this formula? And the Ketchikan view is that you would take required local contribution, strike out local, and call it state, so that what the local school districts would now receive would be state aid plus the state contribution. But I'm not sure anyone other than Ketchikan believes that. I think the more natural way of rewriting this formula, if the required local contribution is no longer required, would you strike out required, would you call this now an optional local contribution, meaning that there would now be total uncertainty about how this formula would work. You would definitely continue to get state aid, and it would still be calculated this way, but there would be an open question over how the optional local contribution would work in this formula. Would it mean as actually paid, so that if Anchorage optionally decided that it was only going to pay $2, state aid would increase by all the amount of money we didn't optionally locally contribute? Or would it just continue to be as defined in the statute? The rules say Anchorage has to pay, I forget the figure off the top of my head, significant millions of dollars.
Well over $100 million.
$100 million. I suspect the state would say, we continue to calculate state aid exactly the way we used to calculate it. optional local contribution for purposes of this formula is defined to be $100 million for Anchorage. So whether you pay $0 or $100 million, it doesn't change the amount of state aid. Which means the bottom line is, what is actually going to happen to school funding if the state wins? I think it's hard to know with certainty, but I predict that what would happen in the real world is, given this uncertainty and given some tertiary effects to what would happen to the way you calculate state aid and how the state can use that in setting its formula calculations, which is very, very Louise, I think it would just blow up the formula and the legislature would craft something new. And what happens in that conversation is anybody's guess. The legislature would be completely free to rewrite the rules however they would like. And in fact, at the municipal attorneys conference, I had asked Renee Broker, the borough attorney for Fairbanks-North Borough, if this all blows up and the legislature wanted to reenact the status quo, couldn't they just enact a municipal tax in the amount of the required local contribution, collect it directly, put it in the state coffers, and then return it or not to the localities? And she sort of said yes. So that is not the clarity I think that people would like to have, but that's sort of my view of the current status of the case and what happened with Ketchikan, actually. So of course, if Ketchikan loses, then we're in the status quo. Jim?
Yeah, my understanding of the formula is that the feds have an impact in there in terms of what can be given by it. They put an upper limit on local contribution. Schools and quality of schools concept. I'm perfectly happy that the state has a responsibility to fund education, as in the Constitution. But I agree with you. I don't know how it's going to come out in terms of the decision. But the state would look for a way. If they think their basic need is adequate, then they'd look for a way to just cut it off the back.
And like I say, in response to that, that is correct.
And
on the federal
there's a
tax
lawsuit
point,
on adequacy at one point too.
and the Supreme Court actually indicated, can we even resolve this case without knowing who has to pay for education? And sort of suggested that there might be a resolution in which they say, we're not going to decide this case until we have additional briefing and a 10-year lawsuit on what the adequate amount of state funding for education is. But on the federal impact aid question, if you want to go down that rabbit trail, that is true. Federal impact aid is like payment in lieu of taxes. It is a money that goes directly to the school districts for untaxable land within the locality. The state can take account of it in its formula funding only if the amount of revenues or expenditures of the 5th percentile school district and of the 95th percentile school district are not do not differ by more than 25%. So if you blow up the required local contribution, there are many scenarios in which, say, 2 or 3 school districts just said, well, we're not paying anymore.
Well, it can.
That would blow up the way federal impact aid can be used in this formula and would force the state to go back to the drawing board and change this. Whether that would happen in practice or not is uncertain, because as it happens, every single school district that pays the local contribution voluntarily complies, voluntarily makes an additional contribution of typically about twice the magnitude of the required local contribution. So one scenario is it becomes optional and everybody just keeps paying what they're paying anyway. Anyway, so I think it got a little off the rails there.
It's
And I apologize, I was remiss. I didn't ask people to introduce themselves. Peterson, will you start? Just go around the table real quick.
Sure. Pete Peterson, Zillwood.
Kathleen Plunkett, School Board.
Andy Ralph, Anchorage School District.
Pat Deacons, School Board.
Jennifer Johnson.
Patrick Flynn
Bill Evans.
Dick Trey.
and Bill Paulson, municipal attorney.
Mike, you don't get to.
Oh, sorry, Mike Abbott, City Manager this year.
Jerry Smith, Principal Clerk's Office.
Thank you.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Pat?
My understanding, the lower option on this has to do to meet the equity issues between the different districts on funding, and you got some state and federal issues there. So simply making it optional, and if it's not provided locally, then you're going to have run into equity issues. So they can't just simply ignore that at that point, that's my understanding. And as far as the timing on response, and I was told this by another presentation, that if they're more than 6 months and they hold paychecks to the school, to the judges, when they're beyond a certain, I know the Supreme Court can waive that if they wanted to, and they could do all kind of things. But I thought that we were thinking that it had to be by March that they came out with it to meet that 6-month obligation.
Well, unfortunately, the way the rule is written for the Supreme Court, they have to circulate a draft opinion within chambers within 6 months, which means that whatever justice has been assigned the case has to send something to the other justices, which in practice is not always a very complete draft, but it can stay stuck in the Supreme Court for a totally determined amount of time.
I forgot, in this formula, is it just for PELF, for the federal aid?
It's not actually PILT, it is Federal Impact Aid, which is sometimes called Public Law, PL, you know what I'm talking about? It's not actually strictly PILT.
So it's not a year-to-year appropriation like PELF is from the feds?
It probably is a
It
year-to-year
is subject to
appropriation.
appropriation, although it is an entitlement, not a.
PELF was.
PILT was about 286. I think.
Yeah.
And it actually incorporates a bunch of strange things. One is untaxable land, one is the amount of federal employees in the area, military folks, on the theory that when the feds have put a lot of people in the locality, that pushes a lot of additional costs onto the local districts.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Falsey, in the basic undercurrent of this case is that the unorganized borough does not contribute to the education of the students in the borough, and therefore the organized boroughs feel they're being unfairly treated, or at least some of them. How does that affect the discussion of federal impact aid? Is it linked in some way, or?
I think it is probably true that information is motivating folks like Fairbanks and Ketchikan, but that is not really in the case as a legal matter at all. There was a different case in 1996 when the Matsu Borough Schools District sued and said, why do we have to pay a required local contribution when all of the REAAs, the Regional Educational Associations that are out in the bush, don't have to pay anything? And the Supreme Court said because they're differently situated. So that's not really even in this case. The only reason that is a current floating through this is that if you think the ultimate goal is to blow up the formula, you could rewrite the formula in a way that does more equalize how REAAs are treated versus actual school districts. I will say, just for putting more weight on both sides of the scale, that the retort from the REAAs is, we don't make a required local contribution, first because we don't have taxing power, and second because we don't have a taxable basis, but third because we contribute in this formula per capita a lot more federal impact aid than the school districts do, because the REAs contain a lot of ANCSA land and other untaxable land, which would be the basis for which would be their taxable property to generate a required local contribution if they could.
Say we went the purist route, or the Supreme Court did as far as Ketchikan. Currently, for the rural education, the legislature is pretty much the school board. Is that correct?
Yeah.
No, the REAAs, which are regional educational attendance areas, do have their own board.
But basically the budget, I mean, it's similar to what we have, where the assembly passes their budget, but they have a local school board that defines how you use it.
I think it's similar, but even more restricted, and this is now totally from memory, and I could be wrong about this. My recollection is that the school board receives money from the legislature in the same way that the Anchorage School District receives money from the assembly, but I believe the REAA's funding is all defined by statute. So there is no, I want this much money this year. I think it's you turn the crank and this is how much money goes to the REAA.
So it's not similar to where the legislature basically is the borough assembly for unorganized boroughs, with school districts a little bit more defined.
I think that's right. I think the money they get is defined in statute and it just happens.
what, if I may,
Tim?
on construction money, that's the thing that, this whole debate was, how do we build schools in rural areas? And I said, okay, well, we, the state, will build them, and then we will pay 60, 70%, whatever it is, of your bonding capacity for those areas that can do that. So that was the big offset. I always thought, boy, they're getting a pretty good deal, but they don't get schools all that often. But this, you take the local contribution out of that. I would certainly argue that, okay, state, you're no longer adequately funding education. So you need to look at your definition of basic need.
Also, if I can sort of follow up on the local contribution aspect of that. Let's say hypothetically that Ketchikan and Fairbanks decide they're not going to make a local contribution. And therefore we have the inequity between, say, those districts and the North Slope and Hillsborough and Anchorage. What is the potential consequence on a federal impact aid? I mean, do they just say you don't get it, or what?
So this is really getting into weeds. The federal impact aid is paid directly to the school districts. So we would continue to get it, even if we no longer met the disparity test of the federal law. The federal law disparity test only governs, this is very esoteric, whether the state in its formula funding can recognize the fact that school districts are already receiving federal impact aid. So if the disparity now became 26%, 30%, 35%, they would basically have to blot out the federal impact aid offset in the state funding formula and pretend like none of the school districts were getting that.
So that theoretically boosts the state contribution because they can't account for the federal aid.
Right.
Which is when they will somehow change the law. You're on the hook anyway. Okay. Does anybody have any legal questions that we want to continue on? I don't want to move, if not, I want to move to the fiscal discussion. Okay. So we don't have anyone in the finance office here today. So I'll just plant this thought, and we'll maybe take it up later. Well, he's from the school districts. Financial office. We're the experts on the tax cap.
You're right. Sorry.
Bill and I argue about a lot.
And I'm going to say I thank you for that.
So, well, I don't think we have the right people in the room to have this conversation today, so we'll come back to it. But what I want us to be contemplating as we do is, what do we do if Ketchikan wins and we know we just know, right? Just accept it as a given. The legislature will then rewrite the law. So local contribution will still be required somehow. How do we manage the municipal finances so that when the legislature rewrites the law and our contribution is again required, even if we get a year or two hiatus, how do we manage local finances so that we're in position to recur, basically, the current scenario? Because that's got to be the key. Okay.
Patrick, in my consideration, we do the TAPS money. Remember the money with the TAPS case?
Hover it away.
We put that aside, didn't touch it until that case was decided. We might think about doing something like that.
That might be the answer. I mean, it's going to be tricky because our constituencies are going to be really confused as to why we're taxing them for something that they're not actually paying for.
I know, but I think if we drive the point home, if we're going to be taxed for it, we're going to have to pay the money back. It'd be nice to have the money aside.
Yeah. Well, we may not have to pay the money back,
No,
but we'll ultimately have to pay it at some point. So maybe it ultimately ends up in the municipal trust. Maybe I don't know what the right answer is, but But Bill, you want to jump in on this?
Well, no, I just want to make sure I understand the concern, like, you know, I see what you're saying. We may not have to pay that money back. Let's say there's 2 or 3 years where, while they're rewriting it, there was no required contribution, and we don't have a legal obligation. Your concern, I assume, is that if we don't tax it and put it somewhere, the cap deflates.
Correct.
And it's a matter of keeping the tax cap inflated so that when they rewrite it and have
What
it.
is the bad word?
Well, it's kind of, that's your concern, right? Okay.
To maintain the capacity to meet our obligations.
Okay.
That's the key. And I'll get Rod on the hook. Actually, I'll like to get Rod on the hook for the next conversation so we can talk through that.
And I guess the other question, if we did that, if we took it like we did the tax money or something, and put it in a dedicated fund somewhere, but never had but how the thing plays out legally, we never have the obligation to back pay the money, so we have this extra set of money now, and we've maintained the funding capacity through the tax cap. Are we able to use that money for something else then?
Yes, and my inclination, and this is off the top of the head, would be to put it in a municipal trust so that it's then paying interest back to the city year after year after year and reducing the tax burden on the citizen.
I mean, conceivably, we might have like $400 million interesting after a couple of years and then be faced with the unenviable prospect of having to do something with it.
I guess we could do a couple extra capital projects too, but I just assume save it in the trust. But that's my information. Tim?
Yeah, my concern more than that, and I understand the concern, and it is a concern, but my concern more than that is what are we going to do for education? I mean, we're taking a huge chunk out of education. What are they going to do with this?
Well, in theory,
Theory is the state will be paying.
yeah, but we don't know.
But I kind of like the idea of putting it in trust of some sort. We could pay off bonds, but that's construction versus academic money.
That's another option too.
But
The other approach you could take is basically at that point, of course, shared services, but at that point where the muni becomes responsible for the facilities and operations of the facilities, and the school district is responsible for education. So then you've never lost your need of what you're taxing for.
That's true.
And you're managing it hopefully with shared service. And you're not doing this finagling that really looks very untransparent.
Yep.
And I mean, I wouldn't have to make this decision, but I wouldn't want to be on the body and have to say, well, we're going to continue to tax for maybe someday when things might be different.
That may be a good idea, actually.
All right, I've got Dick, Kathleen, and Bill.
Just in '89, we gave the building away to the school district, but all we'd have to do is reverse that if we ever wanted to. Was simply reverse the ordinance in '89. I've already got the ordinance. I've had it for years.
What is it?
You were on the school
In
board?
'89, the assembly gave responsibility for all the school
Oh, yeah.
buildings to the school district.
Yeah.
I've got the ordinance
Yeah.
embedded.
Yeah.
Just
Of
matters
course you
reversing
did.
it.
Of course you did.
You were on the list then.
No, I was not.
The eternal ones.
I just had it.
Kathleen.
And there is precedence for that. Kenai,
Fairbanks.
Fairbanks,
They
they
all do it.
manage, there's several that manage the properties. Some of them are because in the case of Kenai, it has multiple different taxing authorities that all blend together.
Right.
But I think that is something that, should that happen, and I think it was something that Dick wants to discuss at some point anyway.
The only problem I could see with this that would have to be addressed is the school district, as far as I understand, is the only taxing service area that's throughout the municipality. Our other service areas do not apply. Police do not apply in Girdwood, fire service areas. So you would have to come up with a way of having a municipal-wide tax for facilities of school district or something.
We collect for area-wide.
Yeah, we do.
That's how you guys are paid. We
Oh,
pay for
that's
the
right, you're right.
assembly and my salary, and it's
Okay,
about
yeah.
$10 million.
That's right.
It's more than that.
I'm so
You make that much
I'm so down in the weeds in that right now.
Yeah,
I get
actually,
it.
the area-wide mill rate's like .1 or sometimes
Yeah, it's
negative
very-
0.01.
it's
It's
very
typically
small.
negative because
Yeah.
most of the non-tax revenue that we generate is assumed to be area-wide. Hotel tax, rental car tax, all of that is, and so it offsets
Right.
the area-wide property tax. So for the last year, it was a negative 0.12 mils.
Yeah.
It essentially lowered your school district assessment for the last year because we've changed so much in terms of the percentage of our revenues that are non-property tax.
But anyways, that's, that would change.
Yeah.
But I still say this is a much more transparent way of looking at it.
And in even those places where the school district facilities are maintained by boroughs, which is a great option in a lot of places, maybe here too, the school district still pays for it. Their taxes, their state aid, they collect money and then they pay, quote unquote, the boroughs to do it. It's still considered a school expense that they then contract with, or however they move the money over to the boroughs for that maintenance.
And again, that might change depending on how this formula, how this comes out with all of the boroughs. So, but anyways, that would be that.
Bill?
I just want to underscore that I think this scenario that we're working around is the scenario in which there is some temporary period of time in which the state is forced to pay us more money. I think that is actually an incredibly unlikely scenario. And that the much more likely scenario would be something like this. So this is in 2014. The Anchorage required local contribution was just north of $95 million, and then our additional voluntary contribution could be up to $97 million. And we paid it all, so we made a contribution of $192. If Ketchikan wins, what might happen is that the state will pay us nothing extra. This is now optional, not required, and this is still optional over here. And to preserve the tax cap, all we have to do is say, well, this year, in addition to choosing to pay $97 million, we will also choose to pay the $95 million. And so it will be exactly the same status quo. It will function exactly the way we used to, except that in theory, we could walk away from the local contribution if we wanted to, but in practice, we probably never would. And the only way that's different is if something happens where someone says, actually, the state has to come in and pay the local effort, and I think it's a skeptical that's happening.
But Patrick, didn't we take care of this with your little ordinance that passed, where we don't have to tax the tax cap? We can tax a lower level. We can go back up.
The way that functions is if we take state monies and apply them post-mill levy, then the mill levy remains the tax base cap basis for the next year. You don't get to use whatever the actual tax capacity was.
I thought we had the capability of going back up.
Nope. That's not how it works. It's the actual levy.
I'll take a look at it.
Jim?
If the school district has to, given the outcome of this measure that I guess is going to go to the voters in terms of should they combine schools or basically use capacity in schools rather than keep all the schools open and rebuild them. That would give, if they have to close Central, then that would give the city facility that they could move into for City Hall, stop paying the rent.
Well,
Anyway,
bring it a little far.
but I-
Just plug it.
Can I just clarify, because that's not what the bond proposal is. The bond proposal is to take care of what we have, to work on operating and maintenance. Closing any school is not a part of that bond, and that's not what our process was. That may be what one school board member said, but that's not what it is.
It was in the paper, so it's got to be right.
All it has to do with is taking care of what we have and maintaining what we have and changing the focus of working on what's really critical. So I'm sorry, but I didn't want to.
That's fine. Mr. Higgins?
And just to add to that, when we went from 17.5 to $500,000, the $500,000 would allow the attachment better from the roof to the walls to the steel structure, so that if it gets to a major earthquake, the roof won't come crashing down. It didn't spend the 17 million, which would have redone all the exterior walls so that the building would be more safe after an earthquake and more stable long-term. It was not, it just didn't address the safety issue. So rather than spend 17 million when we got roofs that need to be replaced, generators that, the emergency generators we don't have heating systems at the point where they're getting parts for them you can't even get, and the efficiency. So that's why we put the emphasis. There's no decision on the part of the board at all in regards to supporting closing any schools at this point. Our survey data actually is against that. I mean, you look at what we got for responses. They don't want to see us closing schools, and coming out with this information is misleading, unfortunately, and it's disappointing. But just so that you are aware of where we're coming, we'll discuss this later. I know.
I said we're venturing into the joint meeting.
And I'm sure we're going to get to it.
I apologize, but I did want to make one sure.
Yeah, fine. Okay. Do we have anything else we think we need to cover today, or should we agree to adjourn and come back and discuss the fiscal issues in greater detail?
One other comment. I know there was a previous mayor who I heard a number of times say that education is a state responsibility, therefore they ought to be banned all the freight. I mean, Mayor Begich was a big believer that the state of Alaska should be funding education.
I mean, that's the basis of the argument, and I'm not sure how valid that is or not.
No,
Mr. Higgins?
I think that's a good point. I remember Mayor Begich's last session with the joint group and said with No Child Left Behind and other issues that we really have a baseline for what adequacy is, and we should look at the court deciding what is adequate. When I was 2 years ago in the Assembly, I remember Senator Dunlap asking me, are we prepared to cut $100 million out of public schools? Because that was their approach from the schools. The question is, what's adequate? We need to quit talking about what's more, but what's adequate. We just finished a study, and I know that will be shared with others, the FICA study that talked about what is adequate based upon a staffing adequacy level. And the question becomes, if we get challenged in this, and if the only response from the legislature is to cut education and cut opportunity for kids, the question is, how do we use that information, and will we go forward with that to define that within the court system? I'm sure whatever they come out for a decision, they're going to give us a time frame for implementation. I don't see them ever implementing it retroactive or doing anything like that. And then the question becomes, do we file legal action? Do we then negotiate with them with a resolution to keep this thing from hurting kids? And that's a discussion I think would be interesting to have as well, because we can even get in front of the wagon if we wanted to. I'm not suggesting we do that at this point, but that is when we get to the table of discussions with what the impact would be of Ketchikan if they did that, before we hear cut, because when I talked to Kevin Myers in my response on this, he said, well, we'll just have to cut how much you get. Okay, and that was the response. I can picture that coming from the legislature. I can picture them not being supportive of additional funding under the current economic situations, but we have a fallback we need to discuss as well, and that is adequacy. And that's what hasn't been defined, and that's what's going to undermine us if we don't define it.
there was a lawsuit.
My biggest concern, and I don't think I'll be here to follow through on this, but I think if the courts do come down in favor of Ketchikan, and first of all, you have the widespread misunderstanding of what that could be, including the parties that are in court on it right now, then I think these two bodies should be very proactive and be ready with something that shows that there's some fiscal responsibility going on here, and that you're making changes to adapt to the growing uncertainty as far as revenues. So I think it could be seen as an opportunity. For me, it's an opportunity called shared services. But I mean, I think it's time that no matter how this comes out, I think these two bodies need to really work on it, not just talk about the kids and not just talk about that it sounds like a great idea. I think there really needs to be between the two administrations, and we're very lucky because we have Mike that could easily help drive this, but I think that's the proactiveness that needs to be done now.
Dick, with your permission, I'm going to ask Mike to add the topic of municipal maintenance or municipal operations of school facilities to our joint agenda.
Absolutely.
Mike, if you could take a look at a couple of, the models that already exist and better options that might be out there.
Yep.
Let's put that on the list for a conversation. I think that's a good idea. Mr. Evans.
No, I accidentally stumbled into this meeting, but I'm really glad to know that you're doing it. I mean, I think it's really a good idea to be in front of this issue a lot. I think and it makes sense to sort of adjourn and look at the finances a little more as this thing develops. I got to believe, my personal opinion is that Wednesday will mark the first day of a new reality in Alaska. The governor's going to roll out his plan, which is going to include an income tax and geo bonds going forward for everything. No, he's not going to have sales tax.
Sales tax for the province and local government has rules.
But I think that bigger discussion is really going to impact also how this goes forward. So we're just going to have to be flexible and playing this thing, but continuing to meet periodically on this issue. It seems to make a lot of sense with some small group like that.
Okay. Well, anybody have anything else before? Okay, so I will get with Mr. Harris and we'll have a more in-depth conversation on finance issues, hopefully before the end of the year. And then we'll add the facilities discussion to the agenda of our joint meeting, which is what, a week?
I thought it was Friday.
Is it Friday? That's fast, okay.
You gotta get the agenda.
Better hustle, Mike. Didn't realize it was that quick. Gotta look at my calendar more often. Yeah, 10 o'clock, okay. So, you won't be here? Well, I'll carry your water for you.
I'm sure.
By the way, if anybody cares, it's the education building not here.
Yeah, I got lost last time. All right, anybody else? All right, thanks everybody, appreciate your time.